which is, thank you, to dive deeper into some of the pending questions around the recommendations being developed by the task leads, and which have been presented to the committee on 2 different occasions so far. We need to spend some committee time really examining some of the more pressing questions around those policy proposals. And so most of our time will be reserved for that. So please stick with us, and please be ready to discuss in some detail with our fellow committee members the designs that are being put forward for the final climate plan. And
Richard, can I add to that
yeah.
quick? So just, I think there's been a lot of questions around sort of what we're trying to accomplish here. And to my mind, there's, as we thought through our preliminary design ideas, some you might feel are further along or have fewer kind of question marks around them. Some have some pretty serious policy or value judgments that we need to grapple with. And I think having those conversations now is important. This isn't to suggest this will be the only time period. Obviously, we asked each of you for 1 to 3, so there's plenty more that probably need to be dug into. But we thought that was a sort of a meaningful bite for each of the task leads, and we can start to advance those. And it may, we'll work on further meeting agenda time to dig into further ones that you want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's also important to note that this is a continuing conversation, and we need to be in dialogue with Vermonters generally on this. So this is just part of the process of developing the asks that we could put to the consultants. What information do we need from them? And also being ready to go out and talk to members of the public and listen to Vermonters about these ideas. So we're not deciding those things today. We're just developing them so that they can be examined in those, both technically and in public outreach. Can we begin with approval of the minutes of the last meeting? I've looked them over and I think they're fine. By the way, I should note that we need to make an editorial change to the posted agenda for this meeting. I think it says July 22nd at the head, and it should have today's date. Any conversation on the minutes of the last meeting, July 22? All right, we will deem those minutes to be approved. Thank you. Next, I think, Jane, you're up for an update on technical topics.
Morning, everybody. Just wanted to use a few minutes to update you on the ongoing work with Cadmus and where we are with respect to certain sectoral components kind of coming online. So first and foremost, I just wanted to, for the CEP work and the Public Service Department's work with SEI and the LEAP modeling, there is a draft, and Ed, chime in if I get any of this wrong, but there is a revision to the baseline mitigation model, as well as a draft first run of a mitigation pathway scenario. And our hope and expectation is that TJ Poore is willing to come and present on that at your next cross-sector mitigation meeting, which will be, I think, an exciting conversation. And so SEI, through the contract with the Public Service Department, has the capacity to run roughly 5 mitigation scenarios through that contract. And we're currently working on a contract with ANR to bring SEI on board with us as well. And so that contract with SEI will be to provide additional mitigation scenarios. And so we'll talk about the scale and scope of how many they'll be able to do. But that it'll also be just general capacity and support for them to collaborate and be on board to work with Cadmus and EFG back and forth, so that they can support Cadmus and EFG through their work as well with the LEAP model. Luckily, EFG has tremendous experience, as I imagine Cadmus does too, but I just know David Hill has a lot of experience with LEAP modeling. So we're in good hands also with the model that SEI is doing with our contractual consultants also. So that's moving forward. We have the scope of work from SEI, and we hope to have them on contract in the next few weeks, but we're working in good faith with them right now. As well, as far as Cadmus and EFG, the focus of their work to date has really been on the first task, which is the critique of the greenhouse gas inventory. That draft report was received on at the end of last week, Friday night. It was shared A&R staff and the core group of task leads with the Science and Data Committee working on that component of the technical analysis. Reviewed the report. We provided some basic feedback on it, and then it was presented at Science and Data yesterday. And now Science and Data has a chance over the course of the next few days to provide more feedback. And then over the course of their next few meetings, we'll be moving to consolidate and form some recommendations that the council will hear about at the end of the month at the August meeting around the greenhouse gas inventory. And any changes, simple changes to make, more complicated changes to make, additions for supplemental analysis, life cycle emissions. So that's really exciting. And that body of work sort of had to happen first, as well as the social cost of carbon and critique of the cost of carbon that the Public Service Department uses. That is also done, and with the Science and Data Subcommittee for discussion for next week on their agenda. And so with those sort of core components of the initial work sort of out of the way for EFG, they are turning their attention like very focused on the mitigation modeling at this point. And so you will have all seen now we had an initial kickoff meeting for transportation a little while ago. Next week, we're meeting again on the transportation sector and pulling more folks into that conversation around the needs for transportation analysis. And then we had a meeting this week on the non-energy sector and sort of kicked off that conversation. And then next week, we'll also be meeting with buildings and thermal with you, Dave and Christine, with Cadmus and EFG, as well as the electricity sector with Liz and Ed. And so lots of moving pieces. These conversations will be, I saw your email, Christine, and haven't had a chance to respond yet, but they will have some sort of orientation to what's expected. They will have seen your presentations. They all have, Cadmus and EFG have the presentations that you gave to the council last week, and we'll have questions about some of that and understanding, and it'll be sort of a get acquainted with the body of work and sort of get the questions on the table and start to move them forward. So I think things are really progressing fast, and Cadmus, I know they're feeling ready and able to meet the timelines that we have, although feeling a little crunched a bit. Largely, SEI is still moving through with the Public Service Department, so there needs to be that back and forth, and that has been a little slower, I think, than expected over there. So, and then at the same time, we'll also be setting up an initial kickoff meeting for the economic modeling. That's the last one to sort of get in place, but Cadmus wants to start to orient to the economic components of the work. So we're setting up a task group for that work as well. And that will be, I'm hoping to coordinate that meeting next week too, but haven't done it yet. So that's sort of the high level overview of all the components of the work, but I will say on public record how I am with working with Cadmus and EFG. They've been really responsive and really helpful with all of this work, and I think are really eager to hear from all of you as the experts on like what they want, what you want them to be doing, where they might have gaps in their knowledge and want to fill. They're very receptive to learning and expanding the composition of their team to serve the work of the subcommittee. So it's great. So I'll pause there and answer any questions around this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Richard.
Questions for Jane about that? Thanks for that rapid fire run through, Jane. It's great to see all that progress happening and planned to be happening in the near future. Is it worth just taking a minute to give us a a preview of what might be coming from a new look at the inventory? Are there
I'm definitely going to ask Jared to do that if you want it.
are there
'Cause I could do it, but Jared or Peter could do it much better than me.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at summarizing, and would just note, I put in the chat, there is a link to the slides that David Hill presented yesterday, which also provide a good kind of bullet point overview. But I think the main takeaways were that one, there was a comparison of the existing inventory with other states. New York, California, and Massachusetts were the comparison states chosen, and also an analysis of how it aligns with protocols and recommended approaches from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the EPA. And while there were some, I think additional and on the margin suggestions that the state of Vermont might look to into the future, it was largely found that the existing inventory is aligned with and following the good practices that are established, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody who's looked at this closely. At the same time, there was an understanding and a recognition that there is a benefit to conducting supplemental analysis that can complement the inventory and assist as a decision-making tool for policymakers to cover some of the considerations that an in-boundary sector-based inventory is not set up well to do. And so specifically, there is talk about looking at life cycle analysis, specifically with regard to energy use, as is identified in the language of the Solutions Act, and other areas where there can be supplemental analysis done to say, what would it mean if there was a GWP 20 value for methane chosen versus a global warming potential 100 value chosen for methane. So there are some identifications of the value of supplemental analysis and suggestions around how that may be done. There were some other specific resources noted that I think it sounds like Peter can correct me or add more to this, but it sounds like ANR will look at possibly look into some resources that Massachusetts has developed in terms of assessing the emissions profiles of different REC attributes in terms of the electricity sector, because they've done some work there building on what ISO New England has done. I think those are the main points. I'm sure I'm missing something, but I'll stop there and see if Peter or Jane or others who were there for that conversation who have reviewed the report want to add.
So I was not necessarily there. I wasn't there for the conversation yesterday, but I have reviewed the report in some detail, and I would, I think Colin Smythe and Brian Woods and others from our team might have some input here as needed. But I think the large takeaway was that the official inventory is largely consistent. There are ways to further refine the ways we do estimates for different sectors. And I see in the chat, Diane asked a question about ag and sequestration. I think one of those pieces is about how we refine some of the analysis we do from the agricultural sector. I don't believe that they took a position kind of one way or another about how to deal with the net emissions question. I think that's more of a policy question, frankly, on the ag side. And then, I think the interesting piece to me they looked at, so that looking at the Oregon and Minnesota models for looking at outside the border emissions is frankly a really telling discussion, and one that is very useful for informing us, because I think as we think about technical policy solutions, we often miss some of the embedded emissions within products and energy sources and other things. that we would do well to think about, because it may change the sort of course of our policy discussions.
And just
Anything-
speaking to sequestration, I thought I would just mention that the carbon budget is also a component of this work. We had a great presentation on that last week at Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, and now are moving forward with a technical conversation about the components of the carbon budget with the task group next week, early in the week. And we also have, just interestingly, we had hoped to bring Jonathan Thompson on from Harvard to partner with Cadmus and EFG on the carbon budget because of his significant expertise in that space. And he has been part of a different team that bid on the technical services for the GWSA. So we tried to recruit him into this team. And in the end, he actually didn't feel like he had anything to add to the great work that Ali Kasiba, who is a doctorate who works as our climate change forester in FPR, has actually already done for the state on forest sequestration. So she'll actually be sort of leading up that work with UVM on the carbon budget. And we're still hoping to partner with Jonathan Thompson on some future forecasting work for sequestration, which is really what he's interested in and he's very capable of, so that we can have some, like a business as usual model for sequestration, and then start to think about what we could do with respect to different policy levers to get it better at enhancing our sequestration potential across the state. So that won't be done for this climate action plan, but we have a scope of work for that, and we're thinking about how to pull him in to help with that for future planning.
So I saw Colin's hand up. Colin, did you want to add something?
Thanks, Peter. I think you guys covered it. The only thing I was going to add was just kind of reiterate Jared's point that that they do call out in the report a lot of different kind of supplemental pieces that could be added that I think would be informative, and that there was just some discussion, certainly in the work group, about kind of how those will be incorporated into the decision-making process if and when they are completed. So just wanted to throw that in there, but I think you guys covered it. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin.
You know, I might just to the last point on this from me, because I missed it, and thank you, Peter, for specifically mentioning the review that they did of the consumption-based emissions inventories from Oregon and Minnesota. You know, there was, it felt to me in their report, a takeaway that was really recognizing the complexity and the inherent, you know, uncertainty in terms of trying to take a consumption-based approach and get accurate estimates of full product supply chains across multiple countries, and the massive lift. And if we think the existing inventory is complex and requires a lot of resources, that if Vermont were to take that approach of doing a full consumption-based inventory, it would be very resource intensive, would not be something that could be done, you know, right away. And that even if we do not, even if we aim for more of a middle ground, which is looking for supplemental analysis and decision-making support tools around the, say, for instance, a life cycle analysis of all of our energy use related emissions, that there was also a identification in the report that there will likely need to be additional resources devoted by the state of Vermont to being able to conduct and annually update those resources.
Thanks, Jared. Will we hear then from Science and Data our recommendation on whether or not to try to pursue a full life cycle consumption-based inventory, or is that really not even on the table as a question?
I mean, our plan at this point is to, you know, we have until Friday to provide comments on the draft review. We're going to discuss it again at next Wednesday's Science and Data Subcommittee meeting. And then the goal would be for the meeting after that, I believe on August 18th, to either just forward the report and its recommendations, from the committee onto the full council, and certainly directly to this committee as well, either as is or with, addendums or additional recommendations or questions that the subcommittee may want to flag. But that's basically the process we're laying out, providing some good time for review and further discussion next week, but trying to see if we can arrive at a consensus recommendation from the Science and Data Subcommittee to this subcommittee and the rest of the council. And if not, find ways where we can identify the areas of, that we may want to additionally lift up beyond what is flagged in the report, or if there's a recommendation in the report that folks may have a different opinion about what to do on. This may be premature, but I have not heard anyone on the committee, certainly not in the task group that's been looking at this, that at this point would recommend a full consumption-based emissions inventory for the state. I think it's more of a focus on, addressing some of the really actionable pieces that, really under ANR's purview. I mean, we can make recommendations, but at the end of the day, the decision is with ANR about, the inventory methodology. But I anticipate that the bigger piece will be around the life cycle analysis, sometimes also called well-to-wheel analysis, or assessing the upstream emissions related to our energy use, which take us a step further than we are doing now.
Okay. In other words, what was alluded to a few minutes ago as some additional looks to help the informed decision-making, as opposed to a comprehensive redo of the inventory.
Right, and I think there was also a recognition that while life cycle analysis is valuable, it's important, that it is contradictory to and would not fit within the existing inventory, which is sector-based and time-bound.
Yeah. Okay.
Those are both valuable pieces of analysis, but need to be handled separately and not inflated or put into the same basket of the inventory.
All right. Well, obviously, how we do the inventory, has the potential to affect the pace of change that we would, and in fact, some of the policies that we might be proposing coming out of this committee. So it would be good to stay in touch and hear back soon. Is there other comments or questions anybody wants to raise about this? All right, thanks.
Great. I think that's
you're ready to dive into the.
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of a preface about sort of what sector by sector. We talked about this a little bit. Kind of the way I thought about this as we put forward our preliminary ideas. We know we need a lot more sort of technical analysis to understand cost effectiveness and understand what the true GHG impact would be. We need to consider equity concerns throughout the process, but there are some sort of fundamental, sort of stumbling blocks or open questions for each of our task areas that the collective brain power here would be useful to bring to bear. And so that to me is sort of what we're going to venture into today, to go a little bit deeper in some targeted areas as identified by the task leads. So I'll put forward the example that I'm going to bring forward, which is the question around the baseline years which we use make sense for our primary emissions sources, right? Our energy uses, which have not changed largely in the last 100 years plus, right? When we're talking about transportation, when we're talking about building energy use, those have been relatively static in terms of fuel types, et cetera. One of the primary emission sources for non-energy is the industrial sector, and within that, about a third, I believe, is comes from our one microchip manufacturer in the state. Prior to 1990, the then IBM, now GlobalFoundries, didn't use the high global warming potential chemicals that they do now, and they used more toxic chemicals that were bad for other reasons and have phased those out. Now we have an accounting problem because and I'll show you a chart in a moment, we've been working with GlobalFoundries to understand their data more, to go back and dig through it. They have some of it put together. It's not completely done, but it's pretty striking that if we think about a 1990 baseline year, they were at zero at that point, or very close to it. And so how do we, it kind of, to me, it kind of flags the conversations that we had early on about, are we driving a sector by sector, you must be responsible for all of, the emissions reductions, required in your sector? Are we going to be sort of pooling these to be looking for most cost effective, most impactful one? So let me show the slide quickly, just so you can all see it and kind of see what I and the team have been grappling with. And I would love your input and thoughts on how we might address some of these things and how we might frame that in terms of our work. All right. Put that in slideshow mode so you can see it a little bit better. All right, can everybody see that?
It's good.
Okay. So as you'll see, this is 1990 to 2020. These are uses of the primary sort of process greenhouse gases that we include in the inventory. Actually includes a little bit more that they've added in as well. It doesn't include their use of heat transfer fluids, but they're working on adding that to it. But as you can see, there was a significant period of transition between roughly 1990 and 1997, moving to a different process, which involved the use of these chemicals. And as you'll see since that period of time, there's been an effort to control the use and reduce the use of those chemicals. But if for our 2030 and 2050 dates, the math is kind of impossible. And so just wanted to sort of get everybody's perspectives. Like, we look at 2005, roughly in the sort of 2.7 or 0.27 million metric tons realm, getting down to about 0.2 now. That's, that they're on the trajectory to meet 2025 from a 2005 baseline, not from a 1990 baseline. And so because the statute in my mind is a little bit, that we want to look at all sectors and look for emissions potential in all sectors, but we haven't really sort of come up with a policy determination as to whether or not we're going to, we expect to see equal results or corresponding results in all sectors. So that's my question. I want your thoughts. I would love, that's the sort of thing that I've been chewing on most. So I see Jared's got his hand up.
Thanks, Peter, and apologies if I sound like a broken record on this, well, first, I just want to say I appreciate you bringing this up for the subcommittee's attention, Peter, and preparing this background information to set the context. I have a sense that we may be conflating two things that may be better to think about separately. So one is, I think, of course, the baseline years that we have to measure total emissions reduction from are laid out in statute in terms of 1990 and 2005. I think it is a separate question. What is the most appropriate reference year to use in terms of establishing each sector's share of responsibility for those emissions reductions? And I think for this reason, and I think we'll see this in other sectors, I think it's come up in the discussion about how much the electricity sector has changed since 1990. One of the reasons that we set up our pathways modeling this way and by this way, I mean using 2018, the latest year of available data for sectoral emissions across Vermont, was so that we could basically ask each sector to be reducing from their most recent trend lines in terms of where they've been recently, rather than going back 30 years where we're going to see these jumps. So I think everybody agrees that we need to get to total and sectoral, emissions reductions. But I do think that the reference year for each sector is not laid out in statute, and I don't think we need to assume that it has to be 1990 or 2005. And I think this is one of the reasons why using the most recently available data would be beneficial, not just for this sector, but for all sectors.
Thanks. And Richard, I see your hand up.
Yes, well, a different reaction might be to ask ourselves, well, what is meant by a sector? I mean, the statute, to its credit, requires proportionate reductions across all sectors. And that's intended to put some discipline into everybody's work, that we can't just ignore some of the important or difficult topics. But, we could redefine the sector here, and instead of putting global foundries in a category of one, there's the industrial sector or the manufacturing sector. There's also the category of chemicals and gases. So you have shown us really compelling data about refrigerants. If fab-related chemicals were in the same category as refrigerants, we could come up with a sector-based reduction strategy that might very well satisfy the statute and be a realistic, attainment strategy for global foundries as well. That's not to say that we should overlook things that global foundries can do. If there was some obvious cost-effective gets there on a cost per ton basis, then it would be a shame not to make sure to get them. But I just think there are other ways to approach this problem, and maybe you've thought of a few.
Sorry, finding my mute when I'm in screen sharing is challenging. I agree with you that I think we are sort of taking that sectoral based approach, right, to look broadly across sectors. And there are opportunity in the refrigerant side, and that represents that, and other ODS substitute use represents the other kind of 2/3 of the emissions picture in industrial sector. I think this problem might be a bit unique in that it's the single largest individually identifiable source in the inventory. And so there we can look to a broad sector of, spectrum of individual actors to get the actions needed in all, other contexts, but this one is in a sort of individualized piece. And so that's sort of the one area in which I kind of wanted to flag. And Colin, you have your hand up. You want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Richard, I agree with that. I think the one issue we may have with that is that that is going to kind of make this a continuing issue, is that even if you do lump it together with the refrigerants, with the ODS substitutes, I think the ODS substitutes are going to have a very similar problem in that there weren't a whole lot of ODS substitutes around in 1990 either. And so I'd have to go back and look at the actual specific details of that. But I agree with you. I had that same thought of lumping them together, but it would definitely take some more looking to see if that would be a feasible solution. But the other thing I'll flag is that the ODS substitutes are expected to increase. They're one of the fastest increasing emissions globally and in the US. And so bringing those down even from 2005 levels to where they need to be to meet the kind of sector targets is probably going to be difficult. So I'm not an expert in those, but my sense would be that it's probably going to be a heavy lift even to just do it for the ODS substitutes without having them try to carry the weight for global foundries or the semiconductor manufacturing as well. But probably more in-depth looking is going to be required in that, but just thought I'd throw that out there.
All right, thanks. Has there also been conversation about looking at global foundries holistically and considering their electric consumption, for example, or their other the consumption of other fuels on the campus, and putting a bubble around that, because it may well be that they have reduction opportunities elsewhere in their operations aside from the use of these chemicals.
Sure. Ed, can you want to speak to the process that's undergoing at the PUC?
Sure. So Global Foundries has a petition before the Public Utility Commission to become its own self-managed utility. And the department has recommended that, or has proposed that one option for Global Foundries might be to have, instead of individual renewable energy standard, energy efficiency requirements, to have a more holistic GHG reduction requirement that could be met through renewable electricity, energy efficiency, electrification, or changes to their industrial processes. So looking at it more comprehensively.
Right.
And then allowing Global Foundries to actually figure out, just set the required reduction, and giving some flexibility to meet that, with the expectation that in the early years, they would need to, not having another industrial process, the expectation is that they would meet the GHG reduction through these other means, electrification,
Right.
Things like that. So that's ongoing right now. Not clear where the PUC is going to end up on that. And since I've got the mic right now, there's another interesting piece that's, because I've been working on this Global Foundries piece in the PUC proceeding a fair amount. One of the things that occurs to me is more of a philosophical. If Tesla wanted to build a battery factory here, they wouldn't be able to. Like, it's just this interesting thing of that what, and I'm not saying this is the case for Global Foundries, but is there essentially something where you need to produce GHG emissions to reduce GHG emissions somewhere else? I mean, EV batteries do not just spring out of organic soil. They're manufactured, they have GHG emissions associated with them. And so to what extent are we carving out in the GWSA? It's not really a question, I guess, for how we deal with it here, but it's something that occurred to me. I just want to throw that out there.
I am certain that there is a way to address that concern, because we would not want the statute to stand in the way of economic development to that extent. And so, I can envision a lot of different ways to basically adjust the inventory, essentially adjust the baseline in order to deal with an obvious growth opportunity. So I thank you for raising that thorny question, but I feel certain that we would find a way to, to permit important growth opportunities to happen in Vermont, even underneath the operation of the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Yep, I think that's accurate. It just, that raises it's a sort of a fundamental question that's out there in terms of where the world is constantly changing and evolving in lots of different ways. And as we look to make reductions from a past state, which didn't include the future present or the future that we're envisioning, it's hard to do something. So I appreciate the feedback. It's helpful for me to think holistically. I think for from our perspective, it's about bringing forward potential solutions that further reduce emissions, and then thinking about how they rack and stack as a whole in the sort of total picture.
Right. Peter, one last point on this. I remember on numerous occasions seeing assessments of the energy savings opportunities at Global Foundries, at the predecessor facilities anyway, and that there were electricity savings available on the campus that were at that point in time did not appear to IBM at the time, did not appear to IBM to be cost effective, but that today might very well be cost effective, and particularly in the context of looking holistically at reducing emissions associated with that facility, those facilities, it might very well be that the answer to the chart you showed us, it lies somewhere else, you know, in the air handling equipment for the clean rooms, for example. There's a ton of electricity used there that could be avoided. That's just an example that used to be the case anyway.
Yeah, I think from a greenhouse, because of the high global warming potential of the chemicals that are in use, it dwarfs the carbon equivalents in. But I think thinking about that holistically and allowing for that sort of GHG per unit of production sort of level of efficiency created, I think is a really good opportunity for us to make some progress there.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for taking us through that thorny one.
Thanks for helping me think through that all. All right, that was non-energy, and I believe we are on to electricity, and that one's yours, Richard.
All right, so electricity mavens, Liz, Ed, can you introduce your thorny questions?
So I will just point out, Jane had said that, has mentioned before, and I mentioned before, that we're having these workshops, technical workshops. Next Tuesday is the electric sector workshop that Liz, and I don't see Chad today, but Chad has been, they've been helping develop as well with Claire McElvaney's help. And we're teeing up specifically some of the same questions that we flagged in the presentations here. At the moment, we're discussing two primary policies. One is 100% renewable energy standard, and then the other is electrification for all, with a particular focus on ensuring that there's equity, ensuring that there's a focus on equity, noting that as we move to electrify, there's going to be significant infrastructure upgrades associated with residences. How do you ensure that somebody, the biggest barrier to somebody, moving to a heat pump or an EV isn't the fact that they have to spend a couple $1,000s in addition to upgrade the panels at their house and the infrastructure at their house as well. So with respect to the res, the 100% res, when we presented last time, we raised a couple of issues, or actually several issues for consideration. 100% res, in theory, obviously there was a discussion earlier about the GHG accounting, the role of hydro as well. But if you just assume for a second, 100% res well-designed can get you to zero emissions in the electric sector, which then helps further decarbonization in the other sectors. How would you set up the res? In-state versus out-of-state, large-scale distributed generation. There's lots of different ways of designing. At the end of the day, you want a little bit of everything. You want a good, well-rounded portfolio. What that means is different to different people. And so one of the things that we had suggested earlier is come up with a general consensus about the trade-offs associated with the different design parameters. What are some of the benefits and costs associated with large scale regional renewable generation compared to smaller in-state renewable generation. Most obvious one could be cost. More bang for, or sorry, it's more cost effective to build a gigantic wind farm off of Massachusetts where you can get lower per kWh electricity. Slightly more expensive to get rooftop solar. And so how do you balance which ones that you want? But at least explaining so that when we get to the legislature, because this will require legislative fix, can we come up with general consensus on how we're defining the trade-offs? So when we get to the legislature, it's not just, no, you're wrong, it's this, it's this. And so that way you get the legislature to make an informed opinion about how they want to value things like economic development, electricity at lowest cost, and different aspects of that. So I'll just sort of frame it and I'll stop babbling for a second and let Liz chime in.
No, I think that's great. We put up the list of questions in the last meeting, so we could tick through all of them, but I think Ed's framed it up well. The only other thing I would, I guess, say is that it starts with the baseline presumption that the role of the Climate Council is to make recommendations to achieve the emissions reductions. And so just recognizing that in that, a recommendation from the Climate Council, if it should come to pass, that we move to 100% res, is it by itself a significant policy and a significant improvement in terms of carbon reduction from what the res would be now. So thinking about the Climate Council's role and where the sort of, I don't know, outlines of that begin and end when carbon reduction is the goal, I think is the conversation we've been having, Ed and I and Chad and others, as well as bringing to you. Our sense is that it is appropriate to say the electric sector is an enabler and needs to continue to be an enabler of decarbonization. And so while there are many design questions and other goals to be potentially achieved through some of those designs, the baseline of achieving 100% renewable carbon-free over a period of time is one that's central to our work. And so putting that out there and then defining the questions and issues essentially for further consideration feels like our job. So I guess I would put out there, do folks agree with that? Where are those lines? Because I think that's where, when we get into the fall, not only will it be interesting to see what the general council consensus is on 100% renewable, but also then what other design features either need to be recommended or shouldn't be recommended and should be left to another process. I'll stop there.
Comments or questions from folks?
I have maybe a fundamental question. Right, given the inventory-based cleanliness of our electricity portfolio, I'm going to set aside the policy questions that underline that for a moment. Is it cost effective for us to go further in creating cleanliness, or would we be better off spending our money on things that are driving transitions in other sectors, right? I think that's sort of a fundamental question in my mind that I don't know if we have the answer on. I worry that we spend a lot of time talking about renewable energy in this space and have for a long time. And the reality is that that's not the greatest source of our emissions. And so is that money well spent?
Excellent question. And one I would just add on to that, is that something that we can ask our technical consultants to give us some advice on? Like, what's the marginal cost per ton of reduction going to 100% res versus some of the other pathways?
Sure. Although I would note it depends upon the design. In other words, the path getting to 100% more quickly, less quickly, the percentages of resources underlying that. So I think those are really, really good questions, but they come back to the design elements issue.
Yeah, good point. Joey, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a similar question about leaning in on our consultants. Another question I have is, while I agree, like the core measure of which we will be graded against is like how the kind of the plan that we craft that will get to the 2025, 2030, and 2050 pollution reduction measures, but the statute is more broad. And I am curious, and I would like the consultants to weigh in. What are the resilience benefits of, you know, in-state generation at a certain scale that is cost effective and brings other sort of benefits with it? And then another question I have for you both is, maybe remind me again, or others, if you have a similar question, which is, as we electrify more, what kinds of, what's the need in terms of like bringing more clean renewable generation online, either, you know, here in Vermont or elsewhere?
That's a great place to start, and should have probably started there. Thank you. I mean, the good thing about a RES, or an RPS, as it's called in some other states, is that it automatically accounts for growth in load. And that's a key factor that I think really gets to the, not concern, it's a hope, right? That we're going to grow our electric usage over time. And, you know, GMP is what they call decoupled. Sales of electricity absolutely 100% help customers, because it reduces the cost to the whole system. It's, you know, it's not an electric utility benefit, it's a general customer benefit. And that's true at the municipal and co-op level too, because of course those are customer taxpayers and customer owners. So that's a really important place to start. If we're going to enable decarbonization in other sectors through a clean electricity portfolio, it is important to do it in a way that will grow with that effort. So I think that answers that both concern or question, because as the load grows, so will the RES obligations. And that's key to enabling that to stay clean, essentially.
And if I can also just chime in, I completely agree, Joey, that there's the ancillary benefits. I mentioned economic development, but you're right, there's resilience benefits. There's a lot of other benefits associated with different types of resources. Also, with respect to your question about timing of, or understanding the future need of electricity, that's another aspect too in terms of the design, is when do we expect the load to show up? It's going to be winter time. You know, EV charging or EVs just are not as efficient in winter, heat pumps, everything else. So there's a lot of different factors that need to go into thinking of the relative trade-offs and the relative costs of the different types of resources available. And completely agree that having Cadmus and other folks help out on that, and the folks in this committee, the subcommittee as well, to understand that. This is something where the department is charged, you know, with a comprehensive energy plan. We're looking at that. I am recommending that we do not have a, here's the 100% res proposal for a CEP, that instead we're mostly looking at, here's the relative trade-offs. I expect that we will have a position at the legislature when it comes up, but for the moment, I'm much more concerned about trying to come up with the best information possible about different ways of designing a res and how you accommodate sort of the benefits and costs, or fully address the benefits and costs, I should say.
Thanks, Ed. Dave?
Thanks, Ed and Liz. I appreciate the way you all have explained this. You mentioned in earlier meetings what you envision happening with REX, or how REX would play into all of this. Could you just reiterate that for me? Because that's a lightning rod for some people. I just want to figure out where we are here.
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by that. I mean, RECs are the enabling economic tool to ensure renewability. I mean, essentially a REC is a certificate that is attached to generation that ensures that it's carbon-free renewability counts only once, right? So it's a tool. The issue that's come up in Vermont has been essentially the timing of when our RES started, and the year of generation that we count. And this varies throughout New England. Some New England states in their RPSs have new generation counted at an earlier point in time. Vermont's res, I believe, is 2015, if I'm remembering correctly, Ed. Hopefully he's nodding. Yes, good. Okay. And so essentially anything before 2015 doesn't count toward the res, which means that any renewable generation built and generating here in Vermont, those certificates wouldn't count toward the res. Utilities have a least cost obligation in their portfolio to the extent that they have those resources, either because they are their own resources or were created through other policies the state put forward, like net metering, as they call it, net metering 1.0. All of those recs are not associated with the res or could be retired in the res, or resources that they acquired through a PPA earlier than 2015. Utilities have a responsibility to save money for customers. And so if those qualify in another state, they have been sold out of state. And it has, BED has put forward testimony at the legislature on the amount of money saved for their customers through that process. We at GMP save money for customers through that process. But it's fundamentally, Dave, when you talk about the controversy, it's fundamentally about what we do count in Vermont. And so there are things you could do in creating a res. I don't think this necessarily, it'd be interesting to talk about what the carbon reduction benefits more writ large would be, given that they're already retired regionally. But regardless, there are things you could do in a res redesign that would account differently for resources built at different times. If you changed it even, I don't know, Ed could tell us, 5 or 10 years, you would capture a bunch more Vermont resources and essentially create the economic incentive and requirement for utilities to retire them here.
And thanks, Liz. I was actually going to do a completely different answer to what Dave asked, which is more about essentially what we call marginal versus portfolio, how we examine that. For example, when you look at, I'm just going to do a slight detour here. For a heat pump, there's 2 different incentives. The utility, like GMP, will provide an incentive for a heat pump. Efficiency Vermont provides an incentive for the same heat pump. So the credit for that heat pump, the GHG reduction credit, or the helping with screen whether or not it's reducing GHGs, is treated differently. So for Efficiency Vermont credit, they're looking at the marginal emissions at ISO New England. What is likely to be the primary energy source at the time that a heat pump is used in New England? And so therefore it basically counts like a natural gas plant. It has emissions associated with the heat pump. From the electric perspective, we actually look at it from the electric utility tier 3 perspective, it's the electric utilities power supply portfolio. So look at the fact that Green Mountain Power is 96% or so carbon free when you include nuclear and other attributes as well. And so a heat pump from a tier 3 perspective has significantly more GHG reductions associated with it than the EVT perspective, even though both are providing incentives for the same heat pump. That's a weird peculiarity that's shown up in the last probably 2 years that at some point we need to address. The reason that relates to the electric sector is there are questions about, for an EV, for a heat pump, should you assume that if a utility is 100% renewable using RECs, you don't know when those RECs are necessarily produced. You just know that it's enough RECs to cover the full kilowatt hour sales over the course of the year. Should you be looking just at the power supply, the number of RECs, or should you be looking at the timing of the renewable production that's actually, or the RECs being purchased as well? Massachusetts has a policy that's helping to address some of this. They have something called the Clean Peak Standard. And part is to reduce peak resource adequacy costs, where they're actually looking for resources that produce power during certain times when peak load. And it's mostly renewable power, if I remember correctly. So one of the issues that I brought up at one point is, does it make sense to actually have a tranche of renewables that have to deliver during the wintertime after dark? And that could be battery storage associated with solar, it could be offshore wind, it could be something like that, demand response. But noting of, here's when usually the dirtiest emissions at ISO New England are, here's when the peak load for Vermont is going to be, and try to marry the policies together to get the most GHG reduction possible. Hopefully that made sense and that answered the question, a different answer to the question, Dave.
Yeah, well, both of your answers were really very helpful. I appreciate that. I'm curious as to the change, the way we look at things, given that the Global Warming Solutions Act asks us to look at our energy use in state and our energy use and its effects on energy out of state. And I just, I'm curious as to how RECs will or cannot any longer be traded, those sorts of things. And
But Dave, this might be a great opportunity for a point of clarification. Global Warming Solutions Act didn't actually change that language. Previously to that, our inventory was supposed to account for energy use out of state. We did that by looking at consumption of electricity, essentially looking at the burner tip outside for electricity generation outside of the state that was consumed in state. The Global Warming Solutions Act language didn't change that section of statute at all. And so to my mind, it would be difficult for us to presume that we need to change an accounting methodology based on that. I could be wrong, but that just, so what I'm saying is that I don't think our previous way of accounting for it was adequate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that the law requires us to fully change course. That makes sense.
Yep.
Thanks, Peter. I'm getting the impression that this conversation can very quickly get into a thicket. And I love that thicket, but I want to allow other questions to be raised.
I do. Jared has had his very pale on against his background hand up for a long time.
I know, I noticed. So Jared, go for it.
On that point, offline or in the chat, if anybody knows how to make my hand yellow and not pale, it'll be great to have it stand out. Anyway, at the risk of stating the obvious, but in hopes of adding valuable nuance, I actually want to go way back in the conversation to where you kicked this off, Peter, and Liz, your initial response, which is that I strongly agree that it will be important for us to do analysis, including cost effectiveness analysis of our different mitigation strategies. And that when we look at the res, the question for me isn't just the pace of the overall requirements in terms of, when do we get to 100% and is that 100% carbon free or 100% renewable? To me, it also matters greatly the relative emphasis on each of those tiers. And I think that tier 1 versus tier 2 versus tier 3, and for those who are not initiated, basically, tier 3 being fossil fuel reduction strategies, tier 2 being in-state, smaller scale renewable generation, and tier 1 being larger scale renewable resources. It's more nuanced than that, but that's my quick summation. And that granted that what Ed just said in terms of marginal versus portfolio, what assumptions are behind it, how you measure it matters greatly. But at least in terms of how we have been reporting and tracking and measuring things as a state, there are very different cost per ton avoided figures associated with each of those tiers. The analysis I've seen from the department is that tier 3 comes out as the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions in the res, tier 1 second most cost-effective, but quite a ways behind, and tier 2 the least cost-effective. Of course, again, assumptions matter, and that analysis will be updated. All I'm saying here is that when we do that economic analysis, I hope we take the time to look at that nuance, that it's not just about the pace, it's about the different strategies enabled in the different tiers within the res.
So, Richard, if you'll allow me, I wanted to give the opportunity. I was had a chance to chat with Liz a little bit about Liz Hansen from Cadmus about what they might be capable of doing, and just give her the opportunity to sort of talk about where they might be, and sort of looking at what they might be able to do quantitatively versus qualitatively would probably be really useful.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So unfortunately, David Hill, who will be leading in this sector, is not here today, so I'll try to speak on his behalf. But we are meeting with Ed and Liz, and I think the other members who are leading the electricity work next week. And so I think this should definitely be a continued topic of conversation. And I think we're open to determining how we might be able to do some of that analysis in terms of what you said. But I think Liz, point taken on, it really depends on the design. And I think to some extent will depend on how much work we need to do to build out in LEAP what your recommendations are versus what is in there now for the CEP, and building upon potentially EAN work that exists or additional analysis that you have will be really helpful if we can sort of leapfrog some of that foundational work and get into some of these more nitty-gritty questions. Certainly, I think we can also draw on any research or analysis that's out there about that sort of going all the way to 100%. And then in terms of the resiliency and economic benefits, we are planning to do an in-plan analysis on the LEAP output. So if you are shifting from out-of-state energy to in-state energy production, that will show up in terms of the economic ripple effects that that has for Vermont. Resiliency, I think, is a little bit outside of our scope, but happy to talk to Jane about that. But I think certainly we would be able to at least speak qualitatively to sort of those benefits that exist from that. So those are my initial thoughts, but I'm taking detailed notes and we'll send them along to David to make sure that we're teed up for that conversation next week.
Thank you, Liz. Joey?
Thanks, you guys. I don't want to pivot too far, but I just want to ask a question. Maybe it's a broader overarching question, but I'm curious if you have thought about, or if there's a need for, or what it might look like, any changes needed to the regulatory, like to the PUC process. I know more and more states, and I just was reading an article the other day from the Rocky Mountain Institute about, you know, how public utilities commissions are or should be realigning how they assess different strategies based on climate goals, climate requirements. And I'm curious if our, you know, is it 30 VSA, you know, when we're thinking about least cost integrated planning, as you mentioned, Liz, which is utilities are required to do, is that reflective of the obligations we now have under the Global Warming Solutions Act? Or are there changes that you might think about or recommend to the process?
So Joey, I will say, so it's 30 VSA section 218C is the least cost planning statute. And been doing this for a while. I'm pretty sure that GWSA actually changed that to explicitly acknowledge that when you look at costs, you have to account for GWSA reduction requirements. It's not an option. In other words, GHG reductions are requirement, or GHG requirements must be factored into least cost planning. I think part of the issue is always going to be you've got somewhat competing factors of affordability, reliability, sustainability. The sustainability piece, I think, is very squarely, there has to be GHG reductions. How you do it then factors into a reliability and an affordability component as well. And I guess I would just be a little bit cautious in terms of everybody's got slightly different takes on how to balance those three objectives. And I think at the end of the day, the legislature can always step in and make that. So I would say I think there's a fair amount of flexibility in place already. That said, definitely open to looking at what other states are doing, what changes they're making as well.
Thanks, that's helpful. It was just a broader question, because when I look at the statute, you know, it still does talk about least cost integrated planning related to our greenhouse gas goals, which are now requirements. So anyway, I just wasn't sure if you had talked about it.
There is an earlier statute, and I'm not as good as Ed. I think it's 202, but I could be wrong. That also requires utilities to look at the Title 10 goals, which of course are ANRs and include the greenhouse gas reduction goals, and specifically puts that in Title 30. So I think the issue on like Rex, for example, that Dave brought up is a different issue of timing economics. It's not a, there is a rec being retired. It's just a question of which rec it is, right? And the argument about in-state recs being used out of state versus being retired here. So I think Ed's right that it's captured in the language that presently exists in terms of whether those things should be looked at by the PUC.
So one question, we need to wrap up this section of our conversation, but a reflection on this conversation is that it's going to be important for the Climate Council ultimately to decide how much detail we want to go into on the recommendations that we're going to be making. There have been a lot of detailed topics touched on in the last 20 minutes that are implicated in a renewable energy standard. And we need to understand, what's really at stake if we say it should be 100%, for example. What do we mean by that? So some degree of detail is required, but perhaps we will be wise to end up saying, here's the broad outlines of what we think the res ought to be going forward. And here are the institutions that we nominate to decide the details on an ongoing basis. And we're not going to try and decide all that. And I've just made a statement that's open to discussion. Comments on that? Christine and then Joey.
I think what you just said, Rich, is really, really important. And the sooner we all can get clear about sort of how detailed we are trying to prepare the VCC to be, and therefore how detailed our work should be becoming, would be super helpful, because I could see this becoming quite messy once it gets into the legislative arena. And so I can't think of how to say this, probably the politically correct way. So being careful about how we stage up the conversation as it moves from the Climate Council into the policymaking sphere and into the legislature, that's a really important aspect of this work that needs to be thought out before we do it. I didn't say that very well, but hopefully you caught what I meant.
Thanks, Christine. Joey, then I think we're at the end of time here.
No, I mean, generally, Christine really sort of said what I was going to say, but it is, I think, important to clarify exactly what we're going to deliver, and also just to sort of set expectations, because I do think policymakers are like, I can't wait for this climate action plan to tell us exactly what we need to do. And I think that we can deliver on some of that. And then we're going to need to, hold and contextualize for people what we can deliver and what we're not going to deliver and why. Because again, this work is like, we're doing this for the long haul now. So I think expectation setting would be helpful.
All right,
I think it'll vary by topic area, frankly, because I think there will be some things that are further along. Any legislature would love to have an outside group of experts hand them the easy button, right? That's not going to happen in all contexts. And so, it's a good way to end. All right, you need to move to public comment. Jane, do you have something to add quickly before we go to public comment?
I did just want to highlight that the conversation at the steering committee meeting on Monday is going to focus on this question of specificity. And we're going to take a look at a revised version of the climate action plan outline in an effort to guide action development and the associated and necessary detail that we need for the actions that we're trying to move forward with respect to immediate action, especially with respect to the legislature and beyond.
That will be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Public comments. I see a couple of hands up. Annette, I think you're first.
Thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. Interesting discussion. I want to pick up on two things that Ed said. The assumption that if we go to 100% renewable, that results in emissions reductions. And I want to pose a question to you that I suspect may come up during the public outreach part. And I wonder if the modeling or accounting that's being done can answer this question. Vermont has built out a lot of renewables. And I guess I'll be specific and say wind and solar. How much has that resulted in emissions reductions? In other words, a look back. Do you have tangible evidence? Do you have that number that proves that building out renewables results in emissions reductions in Vermont? My other comment, which is something I've been sort of puzzling about, has to do with the regional role. As many states are moving to 100% renewables in the region. So, okay, if everybody moves to 100% renewables, what does that mean for the sometimes 60 to 70% natural gas that is in the region? If nobody's buying it or contracting for it, but it's still providing that much generation, I guess I'm missing that piece of how 100% renewables in, let's say, in every state in the region results in shutting down those natural gas plants. So those are my two questions for today.
Thank you, Annette. Chase Whiting.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for your hard work and for the opportunity to comment. My name is Chase Whiting. I'm with Conservation Law Foundation. I'm a staff attorney on the Clean Energy and Climate Change team. I have a question and then a comment, both of which pertain to the earlier discussion about global foundries. The first question, Peter, this is likely something that you've dug into most. The question is, are the numbers that you've been looking at for the greenhouse gas emissions from global foundries, are those absolute emissions or are those normalized emissions? I know global foundries often reports their emissions as normalized, meaning not the amount of emissions they're actually producing, but divided by the number of microchips that they produce, so that it's more an assessment of efficiency as compared to emissions rather than absolute emissions. I'm just curious to know, do you know the unit of measurement that you've been discussing with them?
I'd ask Colin to jump in here, but my understanding is those were absolute.
Yes, I believe those are absolute. And what we've been using, we haven't really incorporated kind of the historical data that Peter showed yet, because that's something that Global Foundries is still working on. But what we use in the inventory from 2011 onward is what they submit to EPA for their greenhouse gas kind of facility specific reporting program. So those would be absolute values.
Thank you for that. So the comment that I have also pertains to the global foundries matter. I think as some of you know, there are in fact two petitions before the Public Utility Commission right now. The first was filed by Global Foundries, which we've spoken about. That petition asked to create what is being called a self-managed utility. Be the first of its kind in Vermont. It's not something that exists under Vermont law right now. This really would be sort of the first foray into this field. And in broad brushstrokes, what the petition is essentially asking for is that Global Foundries, as a self-managed utility, would be able to acquire its electricity from whatever source it chose. It could, for example, acquire from fossil fuel produced electricity generation facilities across ISO New England, but that it would be able to do so as it saw fit, as it's been teed up with the goal of reducing its overhead costs. Right now, Global Foundries purchases its electricity from Green Mountain Power, which it says is too costly. So the second petition, second party, is Green Mountain Power. They filed a petition seeking to amend their service territory to exclude Global Foundries' Essex facility. so that the Essex facility would be independent of Green Mountain Power, would be able to source its own electricity. So there are these two things going on. Multiple folks have intervened in those dockets to join the two parties, Global Foundries and Green Mountain Power. Those interveners include folks representing renewable energy interests, as well as folks like Conservation Law Foundation, which is primarily interested in both the ratepayer impacts for ratepayers in Vermont, of which Conservation Law Foundation is one, but also, and in a very large way, climate change impacts. And so that sort of brings me to the second part of my comment, which is the Global Foundries discussion, at least in today's meeting, was sort of raised as a non-energy sector greenhouse gas consideration. And I guess I would just note that I think it's really both non-energy, in other words, in the industrial sector, but it's also an energy consideration. As Global Foundries has indicated, if they become a self-managed utility, they'd be Vermont's third largest utility. Currently, they consume about 8% of Vermont's overall electricity load. They consume right now, for example, more electricity than the entire city of Burlington, Vermont. A massive amount of electricity in Vermont. They produce approximately 34% of all industrial emissions in Vermont as well. So clearly a big consideration also when it comes to non-energy or industrial emissions. Overall, Global Foundries is about 3% of Vermont's total greenhouse gas emissions, a sizable chunk. And so if Global Foundries does begin to source its electricity from non-renewable sources, as its petition is seeking, or at least have the choice to source from non-renewable sources, fossil fuel sources, unless greenhouse gas emissions reductions occurred in other sectors, it seems very likely that Global Foundries' overall emissions would increase from being 3% of Vermont's overall emissions to something greater than that. Which begs the question, who's going to make up for that? I mean, as it would seem, unless Global Foundries really does make deep decarbonization commitments that are enforced by the state, Vermonters, regular folks, it would seem, would be on the hook for making up those differences. And so I raise this question, or rather I raise this comment in the spirit of just putting some more information out there about these dockets and what I see as the importance of the dockets. And I certainly thank the opportunity to do so and the efforts by Ed McNamara proposing certain solutions to create greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. But certainly this is something that does impact both the energy sector and the non-energy sectors, and is crucial to the overall reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, just noting that Global Foundries is such a major contributor to Vermont's current emissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chase. Next up, George Gross.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for your service. I had two major topics I'd like to comment on. One, when the Climate Council engages with their negotiations with Cadmus CAI for the additional LEAP modeling, I would strongly encourage them to write the statement of work program such that it includes explicitly life cycle assessed greenhouse gas emission factors in that modeling, irrespective of whether the comprehensive energy plan does so for its configuration into those tools. That way, you will be well on your way to making policy-making decisions on the basis of life cycle emissions as required by the GWSA. Given the conversations I've heard today, which alluded to supplemental policy-making, decision-making based on LCA, this seems like a reasonable consequence and way to actualize those discussions. Second, there's been a large discussion today about renewable energy standards. And my conviction is all these renewable energy sources have non-zero emissions, and yet we're treating them as though they do have zero emissions. Case in point, Hydro-Quebec um, any number of other things you could look at if you really want to get into the weeds. The life cycle emissions of even solar and wind have non-zero emissions over the life cycle of the power plant that you've installed. I guess what I would recommend is instead of a focus on a renewable energy standard, that it have really two dimensions. One is what I will characterize as a zero emissions standard. In effect, driving towards zero emissions as best as one can, given the available technologies we have, which arguably none of them are non-zero. They're all non-zero. It's hard to imagine one that would be zero emissions, but it's possible and theoretically in the future that will happen in the next 30 years. That I think would be a really important recommendation to the legislature for the council to bring to them, so that we now look at things a little more honestly about what we're actually doing when we generate electricity. Related to that, I recently filed with your committee a work that I've done in the context of biomass renewable energy standard, which is currently a rulemaking being pending before the Department of Environmental Conservation. Policy comments from the public were closed as last week. This filing I made was essentially a preliminary assessment of the emissions one could see in a life cycle of a existing power plant, in this case, the McNeil Station in Burlington. The major gap in that analysis that I did was the sequestration part after you've done combustion. One thing that was very prominent was the scale of the emissions. Even a cursory examination, like as I did, suggests there's a lot of emissions going out for each megawatt hour. And I'm concerned that when I step back and look at the policy recommendations we're doing in the thermal sector, the council seems to be suggesting we should do more biomass for large scale heating and perhaps even for electricity generation. And both of those would incur significant carbon dioxide emissions, and it's not clear that sequestration of those emissions has been accounted for yet. And certainly the renewable energy standard doesn't, as written today. It would have allowed it to be effectively a zero emissions source that does not comply to the Global Warming Exclusion Act. And that's not actually true if you look at the reality of it. So I would encourage the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee to address this topic of biomass in their portfolio a little more carefully, with a particular view to the life cycle emissions and how they would be sequestered. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, George. Well, we're at the time for our break. We'll take a 15-minute break at this time. Anything further before we break? Anything urgent?
Thank you all for a great
We'll be
discussion.
back at 12:45. 14-minute break. Okay, folks, we're assembling, getting ready to go. George, I think you have a legacy hand up. You might want to drop it when you can.
Got it.
Thanks.
Hard work keeping that hand up.
That ever happened to you in school when you have to use your left hand to keep your right hand in the air?
Yes.
I'm trying to count noses here.
Yeah, I think if possible, people could turn their videos back on briefly if you're still chomping. Fine, but just to let us know that there's somebody on the other end so that we can establish that we have a quorum. I think you're good, Richard.
I think we're good. We've got a quorum. All right. So our next simple topic is the building sector. And David and Christine are here to introduce us to the challenging questions that they would like us to deliberate on. So should I just turn it over to you, Dave, Christine?
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate that. So I realize we put up 2 questions, but given what I heard today about the carbon inventory and George's comments, what I'd like to do is hold off on discussing the biomass question and jump in and use the time here to focus on the second of those questions, rental property efficiency standard. Of course, it's on the agenda. If folks want to discuss the other question, that's fine. What I think I'll do is share my screen with you all, hopefully quickly.
Another baby picture.
And they're everywhere. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So in having discussions with folks in this committee and with the larger council recently, Christy and I were able to put together 2 basic points. It had to do with the key challenges we're facing in the building sector. And that has to do with the content of carbon content of fuels and the efficiency itself of buildings. And we try to incorporate the social justice and equity observations because we're trying to build those in up front and be conscious of those, because we think whatever this transition is, it needs to be a just transition. And so when we think about buildings, we learned from Vermont Housing Finance Authority that Vermont's housing stock is dominated by really old buildings, largely buildings built before 1975. They report that about 19,000 Vermont's buildings are substandard, and that means lacking heat, complete kitchen, complete bathroom, using coal heat, some of them. And so when we think about strategies, as I mentioned, we discussed the clean heat standard, some degree, and weatherization at scale. We've had those discussions, and I think you all are somewhat familiar with those. But something we haven't gone into detail about is something called a rental property efficiency standard. And I think what this does is it helps to tie together those other pieces. And about a quarter of all the homes in Vermont, about 80,000 homes, are used or intended for rental purposes. Chittenden County has 36% of Vermont's rental housing. So you see a large chunk there. And we just think that this, addressing this issue of carbon emissions in the building sector and doing it in an equitable way, that this is a logical opportunity for getting after energy savings. really affordability is the key ingredient of equity. It really doesn't matter if there's a low income solar carve out, for example, from a program if you can't afford to pay your bill, right? But we all know that, or we're all generally aware that when you lease a piece of property, there's a split incentive created, a barrier to doing things about efficiency. Capital improvements to save energy, avoid carbon emissions are difficult to get because one party is going to pay for the improvements while the other party maybe receives the most of the benefits. And as I noted, if a renter can't pay for improvements in the first place, then it's really a tough, an especially tough lift. So a rental property efficiency standard is a performance standard that we're proposing. It's for existing residential properties. It would require property owners to meet minimum efficiency levels before they can be authorized to rent those properties. And I want to emphasize these are minimum levels. These aren't efficiency levels like you'd seeing in, for instance, in new construction. There are a number of places doing something like this already around the country. I'm going to use Boulder, Colorado as an example. They have something called a Smart Regs program. It was adopted in 2011. It applies to single multifamily residential properties to meet efficiency standards. And notice it kicks in 8 years after it was adopted. I think the really important lessons from Boulder are that there's a very long implementation time frame, modest standards, as I mentioned. But what that does is encourage early action, provides for financial support, training for landlords. This would include rebates, for example, low-cost energy assessments, technical assistance. And I've pointed out in prior presentations, Vermont has that capacity already. It's really important. The Boulder example points out the need of understanding not just renters, but also landlords. There are sophisticated businesses, large businesses that rent properties, but they're also retirees just renting an extra room. And so it's important to have the outreach that will attempt to incorporate the interests of those two extremes, if you will. We think that the ability to participate in the clean heat standard allowance market is another way that a rental property efficiency standard might work. In other words, those efficiency reductions can help Vermont meet its climate goals and get credits for it. The equity considerations are not surprising, have to do with the improved efficiency of housing themselves. The occupants have a safer house, they have a more comfortable house, especially the energy burdened ones. They can have a house that is a little bit more affordable, a residence that's a little bit more affordable. Providing financial support for landlords could be conditioned. In other words, requiring them maybe not to change rents for some period of years afterwards, because as soon as a building is improved, there's going to be that inclination. But the idea is not to displace people by improving the energy efficiency of rental properties here. So basically, those are the outlines. I'd love to hear any questions, y'all, and I'll do my best to provide clarifications for you. As far as the next steps for stakeholders, I think we need to better understand how existing programs are out there and how they might work to maybe be expanded to incorporate something like this proposal. And as I mentioned also, incorporating all the views of stakeholders will be really important. This has been a tough, doing things with buildings has historically been a real tough sell in Vermont, and I am not surprised that this would be a similar undertaking. So I'm happy to have, to do my best to respond to your questions or your comments.
Thanks, Dave. Christine, do you have anything to add to that before we go to open discussion? Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, I was busy raising my hand. Thanks, Dave. That was, I think, very well said. I guess what's on my mind at the moment is I'm trying to recall the recent effort, which I think was to create a system for registering apartment buildings that did not get signed by the governor. Am I recalling that correctly, and wondering whether any of those among us have any thoughts about lessons learned from a sort of political strategy point of view from that recent discussion, if I'm recalling that discussion did happen fairly recently in Vermont, and how that would portend the possibility of advancing this cause further than the attempt to just register apartment buildings got. Maybe there isn't anyone
Yeah,
here who,
and
who
yeah,
who's
any
recalling
comments?
what I'm recalling.
I wasn't around, Christine, but I did hear that there was an initiative to require registration of landlords and that it was not enacted. That's pretty much all I know.
Yeah,
Christine,
okay.
I
Well,
do from
that's something I can
what,
look into.
from what I understand, and I only know it's a little bit, is that part of the consideration was that it was one of those things that came up during the veto session, I think. And so it was a quickly moving item that has a tendency to be a challenge. And so more deliberate conversation may have, I don't know that this is outside of my realm, but I thought I remember something about that.
Yeah, okay, I can look into that more, but let's turn for their thoughts and input.
And then, any other comments? I've got a question. Whenever this topic has come up in the past, one of the first questions raised is, well, what can you tell us about the distribution of types of landlords? There has been a lot more interest in a rental standard being imposed upon truly commercial landlords with lots of units and lots of capacity to manage those units, in contrast to what could be called mom and pop rental property owners. In typically the conversation gets around to the question, well, how can we help small owners to improve their properties, providing incentives, weatherization assistance, and what have you, as opposed to imposing a standard. That's typically how the conversation has gone. Do you have any data on the distribution of types of landlords?
Rich, I do not, but thanks for bringing that up. That's something I will look into and be able to respond to. In the several years that the city of Boulder took to do outreach to different landlords, they ran into this challenge, and they ended up not excluding those landlords after all, but they found that there were ways of working with them that would accommodate them. And as I mentioned, there's a long lead time, and there is, during that lead time, a lot of support. There's a lot of carrots, so to speak, being put out there. And one of the results, sort of surprising, I don't know if this happens with similar efforts around the country, but they found that when these properties were opened up and when they were surveyed, they found that landlords were willing to make even more investments, efficiency investments in their premises than were actually required by this ordinance. And so it's something to look into, but it's I think there are some really positive opportunities here.
Joey?
Well, first, I just think I'm glad you're raising it. I think I agree it's an opportunity, and I think there are some very important considerations we have to take into account. I think that just to step back and maybe reflect a little bit on what you're trying to explore, Christine, in terms of the difficulty with the rental registry, understanding what that was about, I think would be important. But if it is political, I also just think it's important to remember that I mean, we have to make strategic decisions that are that are going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it changes the political dynamic, I think. And that's important to remember broadly. And I also think that, it's been difficult to have, where there's been a push for a decade for energy efficiency disclosure, sort of like some people really hate to make it akin to this, but like a miles per gallon sticker for a home. That seems like should be fairly easy hurdle. It has been challenging for some very, I think, some legitimate reasons, but I guess I do think what you're pointing to is a big issue, and it is a big equity issue. And in Montpelier, my city of Montpelier, there has been a conversation about, okay, we'll give, landlords, and maybe you can do it, landlords, to your point, Richard, about not all landlords are created equal. Some are mom and pops, and we don't have, you could make it income sensitive to landlords potentially, and give landlords a little bit of lead time to make these investments. And if they don't, switch who pays the bill. I mean, different strategies for, instead of shackling renters with very high costs, if in unweatherized homes, make it incumbent upon landlords to foot the bill until they can do that themselves, or the state can help them, or we can help them make those types of investments. Anyway, some very random thoughts. I appreciate you raising this. But I also just want to sort of underscore that I feel like these kinds of things are going to be really important, and I don't want us to get bogged down in the political reality before we put forward the different types of strategies that we think are going to get us where we need to go.
Yeah, one reaction that pops to my head based upon the comments so far is that if there are a variety of ways to address the rental properties conundrum, that the Climate Council's work at this point might be to envision a process that would bear down on that and come up with an examination of a variety of options, and get going on what's the best package of options to address this particular need, and as opposed to choosing one. Different examples that have, I know Dave and I have had this conversation for years, I think, and other folks in the housing world have too. A different option is a time of sale requirement. That is, the standard kicks in when units are changing hands. And that is, in a very practical sense, often the very best time to improve a building. Either in the 6 months before or 6 months after a building changes hands is a huge opportunity. And you could link that to some provisions in the property transfer tax that provide an extra incentive for improvements at that time. A different example would be to impose equipment standards at time of sale or installation of new equipment. So there's a portfolio of approaches to this particular problem, and it might be that you have identified the very best one. And it might be that as a council, we would want to put an exclamation point on this topic and try to think up the best way to create an engine that would go after it, even if we don't know what the right package would be. That's just a thought, a reaction to the fact that this is such a difficult topic, and there's potentially so many ways to get at it. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. I just want to start by thanking Dave and Christine for your focus explicitly on equity and justice considerations, especially for renters. One of the reasons that I think this is so starkly important as we had an incredible summer intern with EAN last summer, Jenna Slayton, who did a report for us that's available on our website, and it's summarized on page 26 of our latest annual progress report, which we put in the chat. But what she looked at was what are the different fuel or heating types by household income, and in regard to whether or not that home is owned or rented. And the findings were striking. I mean, this is from the latest available American Community Survey data. And what we found is that in general, the lowest income Vermonters are heating with the highest cost heating source on a per MMBTU basis, old electric resistance heating systems, not to be confused with modern efficient heat pump systems. And it even worse when you look at renters versus homeowners. The number of folks who are living in apartments still heated with old resistance electric systems, which again are the highest cost, it's a full 20% of the lowest third of income earning renters in Vermont. So, you know, that really underlined for me how stark this split incentive problem is, and that we need new strategies to make sure that the folks who are least able to pay for high cost energy and are, you know, sometimes the most vulnerable to, you know, in terms of health conditions, et cetera, of buildings that are not kept up. And so I just really applaud the focus here. I think this is worth, you know, including in terms of what we dig into deeper. I also agree with Rich that there's probably other complementary strategies that could get at some of the same challenges, not mutually exclusive by any stretch, but that could be added to this. But I just want to first thank you for looking at it, because I think that as we look at the data, not just about emissions, but also about energy burden and costs, renters in Vermont are in a different situation than homeowners, and low-income Vermonters are in a different situation than upper and moderate income Vermonters. And we need strategies explicitly designed to make sure that we work with them and prioritize them first, not last.
Thanks, Jared. Joey.
Jared pretty much said it. I mean, I just wanted to be appreciative, but also liking your idea, Rich. I think there's probably a compendium of different strategies that could get at this. And then it's a little tangential, but I've raised it before, I'd raise it again, because I think it's a different type of equity issues as we see more migration, climate migration, whatever you want to, COVID migration into the state of Vermont. And I do think it's a moment in time to engage new Vermonters and make sure that, to the best of our ability, if there are equity considerations at the time of sale, as you were mentioning, Richard, that we're welcoming new Vermonters, but also finding different ways to encourage them to make investments at the time of sale, and or if they're become second homeowners, or they are rental property owners, that I just think it's a moment in time to not exacerbate equity issues when we're welcoming new people, some of whom have more capacity than others. I don't know what that looks like, but I just want to keep raising it, because I think it's driving our housing market into more challenging arenas.
I just wanted to add that we are talking about a split incentive issue with respect to buildings, but when it comes to the task of this subcommittee, we're looking at sectors of the economy where people are making money putting carbon in the air. We should remember that people are making money putting carbon in the air by renting buildings. And it's not really a split incentive issue. It's can you square off with these things? I appreciate your comments, Richard, about studying things. There are all sorts of very interesting approaches. I have no idea how fast properties turn over in Vermont, but I wouldn't think that they turn over as quickly and would have the effect that we're talking about, where you take 6 years or 8 years to support landlords to improve their properties to minimum standards And then after that, require them to do that if they haven't taken the financial support. So I just want to make those observations. Thanks.
Well stated, Dave. Other comments on this topic or on other topics related to buildings? So we're a little bit ahead of time.
So Rich, can I just ask a broader question related to, we've heard from, Christine and Dave about the clean heat standard. I'm just curious if folks have either the co-chairs or what is the process? How are we conceptualizing the process to unpack all of these very big things in the time that we have? I feel like we need to get to making recommendations, and then there's the important public engagement process. I just am curious, what that process looks like for our work, because there's a lot to unpack here.
I'll take comments on that. And I think we are in a time jam. That's obvious. And we are simultaneously asking the consultants to help us understand scale and cost issues. And while we are preparing to do outreach in coordination with the department in some cases. And we do need to have a simplified portfolio of ideas to take to the public so that we can solicit public input. Simultaneously, in my view, we need to be bearing down more on the details of the proposals that we think are likely to emerge. And certainly for weatherization at scale and for the clean heat standard, there's a great deal of design work going on in parallel. So I think those two policies could be ready for very detailed discussion when the time comes. But we don't want to get too far ahead of the public process, and I certainly don't want to. But I'm circling back, adding up my thoughts here to revisit the topic that we touched on earlier this morning, which was the degree of detail that is likely to be in our plan. We need enough detail. We need to have examined these things closely enough to be convinced that they're good proposals. But we probably are not going to create a plan with a ton of details built right into the plan. I think those details are likely to be included in parallel documents. I toss this to Peter if he has different reactions.
I think creating the perception that we're going to be able to create parallel documents, I think might be too far as well. I would more likely to say follow-on efforts, whether that's conversation at the legislature or additional work. I think some of them, if it's not that we can't get them ready because we don't have the work capacity to do it. I think it's more of a question of are they ready? Have they had the engagement and conversation and all aspects and analysis that would make them not necessarily be able to go in parallel either. So I think it is just being clear on that. I do think, Jane's guidance from the steering committee on Monday will be really helpful to understand how deep are we going? Or how deep should we be shooting for at a baseline and then try to exceed for all, for some of them.
Okay, when I said parallel documents, Peter, just to be clear, I wasn't necessarily thinking of parallel documents created by this committee or by the Climate Council, but
no, I know. I think parallel suggests that they're moving along at the same pace.
Right. Your formulation works for me. A lot of this will require follow-on work, obviously. I have Dave, Jane, and Christine.
Thanks, Rich. Just to answer Joey's question, Joey, so for the first time, we're going to be able to sit down with Cadmus and Energy Futures Group, okay, as Jane mentioned. What Christine and I and so much of the discussion we've had, what we've been able to do is something like a literature search before you actually do, you know, very cold and focused analysis. But when it comes down to it, the question I hope they'll be able to ask is, how many tons per dollar are you going to be able to get if you weatherize this way, if you change fuel this way, if you adopt a portfolio standard for renters? Number one. Number two, because the equity portion has to be included in that and recognized. To me, that's the first part, is access. How much access have these communities had to this decision? And number two, in addition to access, it's allocation. How much are they being allocated of benefits associated with this overall effort? So that's what I have in mind as we sit down with Chris Nemi and company. And the last thing is that Rich pointed out on the last meeting with the Climate Council is that, and Jared pointed this out more pointedly, $2 billion a year goes out of the state in form of fossil fuel to pay for buildings and for transportation. Let's keep some of that money here by doing these sorts of things would be my last observation.
Jane?
So, yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit on timeline and again, draw your attention to Monday's steering committee meeting, but we had a really sort of power out session yesterday. Marion and David Plum and I working on the refined milestone chart, as well as the climate action plan draft that I spoke to earlier. And as of now, I don't want to like scare anybody, but as of now, the way the schedule is shaking out is that the mid-September, September 13th council meeting will focus on cross-sector, and recognizing that you all are prepared to do your stakeholder engagement this month, and ag and ecosystems and rural resilience are only just now in the planning stages for their stakeholder engagement. And so we have you guys going first, where that meeting would be a substantive conversation about the mitigation pathway analysis. So understanding what's been done around the technical analysis and the conversation around how all your ideas add up. And then we would have some dialogue around what you learned through the stakeholder engagement. And then the hope would be that cross-sector would be able to put together a full package of actions to have a discussion at the steering committee level, at the council level, recognizing that that list is going to be somewhat exhaustive and hard to consume in one meeting. So we'll have to think a little bit about that. But then the next time cross-sector would have a substantive agenda would be at the end of October, October 25th. And that would be when we would be like everything, you would have your economic modeling, you would have your analysis, the detail that you're going to want to provide or not. So it's coming really fast. So Peter, I mentioned this in conversations with some of the other subcommittee members offline this week, but my expectation is Peter and Catherine and I meet weekly, and we should be fleshing out a schedule for a work plan schedule for the rest of the subcommittee, understanding if these milestones and dates are adopted with the steering committee as such on Monday.
Thanks, Jane. It's good to have that roadmap. I mean, it's daunting, but we need to know what it is. Christine?
I have two questions, I guess, and maybe one comment. Can you remind me who actually sits at their desk and writes a draft of the climate action plan? I know it won't be me, but I can't remember who it will be.
Well, we're going to talk about that again on Monday at the steering committee meeting, in the vision of the draft. But most of the components of the climate action plan will be funneled up through the subcommittees, and then speaking to how we pull together the larger visions and like summary statements and stuff is what we're going to discuss on Monday. But I mean, the response, Marion and I are the ones who are tasked with being that primary state staff responsible for that. But we have some other folks that we're considering as well and thinking about other processes.
Okay, thank you. That's a very clear answer. And I thought I heard someone make reference to your, meaning our, economic modeling being done by X, Y, and Z date. I want to push back on that and say it's not our economic modeling, it's the consultant's economic modeling. And I believe we're serving in an advisory and oversight role, helping ensure that their work is headed in the direction where we think it should go. And then we receive the knowledge gained from their work and advise on how that be used in development of the plan. So I just want to clarify that that's is or is not an accurate statement of how we're staging this up.
I think that sounds very accurate, Christine. Thanks for that clarifying point.
Okay.
All right, nicely
Okay,
stated.
so I'm assuming we're going to start hearing a lot more from the consultants than from ourselves as we step through the next phase of this process, as the consultants actually focus on the work that we're advising and overseeing, and that they will be advising us on what they're learning so we can advise back on what should be in the plan. Is that correct? Because we've all heard from each other a lot. And we've heard, for those of us not on all these other committees, if you're talking about just this committee, we've heard very little from the consultants. And I'm assuming the work starts to shift to them as it goes broader and deeper. Is that correct?
Let me answer that. I think generally the depth, yes. In terms of the analysis, I think in terms of our thinking through some of the value-based or policy-based decisions, that's part of what we want to get. We were digging deeper into today, because not all of those are answerable by different forms of analyses. And so I think so appreciate, but yeah, I think we're all looking forward to having more to work with in terms of ways to develop priorities amongst our recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks
All right.
everybody for that conversation. Thanks, Dave and Christine, for putting another important topic on the table and for highlighting the social equity focus that we want to bring to that.
As we transition to the transportation group, and I know we have already cut into your time and you have the biggest list of ideas and the biggest source of emissions, I do want to flag for everybody that the Biden administration has just announced vehicle efficiency standards are back on the docket, as well as they have set a goal of 50% of all new vehicle sales by 2030 to have them be electric vehicles, and to use the money in the infrastructure package and ARPA to drive that process forward. So that's good to have that federal leadership, and it shows the dynamic nature of the area in which we're working, but exciting stuff, and speaks to a lot of the efficiency pieces that Gina and Joey will chat about.
Gina and Joey.
Yeah. Can I just respond to that? I was wondering if the consultants, because this is a new policy framework that will affect what vehicles are available for sale in Vermont, will the consultants be able to incorporate these changes in their predictions in terms of emissions of our fleet?
So I can speak to that. My assumption would be that we would bake some of those policies into the baseline in the LEAP modeling, so that it would be accounted for sort of as an existing policy that Vermont will be able to take credit for, and that will contribute to sort of the overall decreasing in your transportation emissions. So yes, I think that certainly that should be part of the overall portfolio that we're looking at. And just quickly to Christine's point, I think agreed that we'll be advising you. I think Jared and others can speak to the way that we've been engaging with the Science and Data Subcommittee and foresee a process like that unfolding here. As Jane mentioned, the dates she just shared are hot off the presses from the meeting she had yesterday. So we'll be sitting down with her and working through sort of what the timeline for us presenting things to you will be.
Christine, you have a question? You're muted.
I did not in any way mean to imply that I was concerned about whether the consultants will be able to serve us well. I've been a huge champion for the Cadmus EFG team, and I'm greatly looking forward to working with you. So that's not, I was just reflecting more from the committee perspective, how we're going to step through our roles in this work.
I think we have a lot to work through in a short period of time to get to that some more fidelity, because that timeline, as Jane's just reflected, feels like there's an abundance of effort that needs to occur in between now and then, and it is intimidating. So more to come. Transportation.
Okay, easy peasy. All right, so in terms of the charge in front of us, Jared, do you have a quick question?
Sorry, Joey, just before we go into that, I had a follow-up question from Peter and Liz on the Biden announcement on the modeling. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. My understanding is that the emissions standards going into force in terms of going back to the Obama era fuel efficiency standards, that is something that we should expect and can be modeled. The 50% EVs by 2030 is an announced goal. It is not legally binding. So that would not make sense to include in a baseline analysis of what's going to happen as business as usual.
But there is, what I read in the New York Times during this meeting was that they are going back to Obama, but there are plans in the next year to go further. And
I'm just trying to make a distinction.
So yeah, no, I know we've got the Obama, but and then there is this goal that's out there. But in terms of emission standards, the administration is going to go further, according to what I just read an hour ago. So can that be factored in? To what extent?
Point is that we should.
I think it'll have a big effect on potential vehicles, maybe 20 years out, 15 years out.
Yep.
So
Jared, point taken on the difference between the binding standard and the 50% goal. My understanding of what's in the LEAP model for the CEP is that internal combustion engine sales are rapidly decreasing towards the middle of the next decade. So I don't actually know that goal will be that far off from what you all are considering anyway. But yes, we will make sure to treat those two separately. Good clarification.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the meatier topics that we were wanting to cover, I mean, we could spend, a full day on each of these meaty topics, but I think what Gina and I have identified, informed by a lot of, sort of our task group engagement and, our work with you all, is we have some regulatory tools at our disposal in the transportation sector. But we don't think they are enough, and they are not necessarily a foregone conclusion. So we wanted to explore a few of very specific things, and then we have a longer list of other regulatory strategies that we'd love to explore with you further on. But as you know, we are participating. We are a Section 177 and ZEV state. So we're participating and following the California standards. This is a really important regulatory program that we need to maintain our participation in. And also there's an effort afoot to look at medium to heavy duty programs that require increasing vehicle efficiency for medium to heavy duty fleets. So we want to explore that. I'm going to turn it over to Peter and his team in just a minute, because the expertise really resides with the DEC team and Deirdre Ritzker, who's on this team, and may be able to provide us a very quick high level overview of where we are and what are the, what are the sort of opportunities in front of us or the need in front of us to continue to maintain our commitment to that program. We also wanted to explore the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which Vermont has been at the table and continues to be participating in that cap and invest program for the transportation sector. We wanted to sort of explore that big tool with you as not only a revenue generating, but a pollution reducing program, with our commitment to wanting to explore complementary strategies to go above and beyond that program to ensure equity outcomes. And then also looking to have a conversation with you all about a potential, what they call like a fee bait or a some sort of program that would send a price signal at the time of purchase. So that's like three big massive things that we really want to unpack with you all. But I think maybe starting first with the ZEV program, the section 177, and acknowledging that we think there are other strategies that we really want to explore, whether it's a low carbon fuel standard, changes to our, land use programs like Act 250 and beyond. Gina, what do you want to say before we turn it over to Deirdre?
Well, I just want to say that the regulatory set of policies is there's a long list besides the three that we're going to hear, and I know Joey mentioned that. There are also big conversations being had about funding policy, which we aren't even talking about today, and we need to at some point around transportation and incentive programs and charging infrastructure, thinking in terms of incentives and disincentives and funding. And then there's the whole messy issue of smart growth and when and where we have that conversation. There's a lot of overlap with the other committees. I believe we need to sit down and figure that out together at some point. Knowing what happens on Monday, to what extent that we need to be detailing these recommendations, these actions is key. And should we be involved in that? Should we be listening to that conversation? Jane, will you be getting back in touch with us? Because I think that maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that's got to drive what we're going to do in the weeks ahead. Our list is long, it's complicated, and today we're going to focus on three discrete things because that's all the time we have. But we need to somehow, somewhere, have these other conversations about transportation. Go ahead, Joey.
Well, just the last thing I would say really quickly is maybe we don't have time to focus in on the three because we're running up against the hour and want to hear further public input. But if we can even tackle two that are sort of like already in process, which is our existing participation in section 177 and ZEV and the conversation about TCI, I think that would be very important and could take the conversation even further. Because as we heard from Liz and Ed, we have fairly strong regulatory systems in place for the electric sector, and we've made progress there. We have a clean heat standard on the table for the thermal sector, and these are the two programs and others that we'd like to explore further for our most carbon intensive sector, where we don't have enough tools in our toolbox, is our estimation. So I want to turn it over to Peter and to Deirdre to walk through the ZEV program, where we're at and what's possible and what's needed.
I will entirely defer to Deirdre because she is the expert in the room on it, and see where we are on those programs. And then I'm happy to talk about TCI when she's done.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to provide some more information about the regional efforts and California emission standard programs that Vermont is already participating in and or could participate in the future. But first, I'm going to start just with a tiny, very small piece of information about the Clean Air Act. So we're kind of all on the same page. So the Clean Air Act requires EPA to establish motor vehicle emission standards. And then there's section 209 of the Clean Air Act that preempts states from setting their own vehicle emission standards. But it also provides California the authority to set more stringent motor vehicle emission standards than EPA. And under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, that authorizes states, certain states like Vermont, to adopt California's motor vehicle emission standards in lieu of defaulting to EPA's standards. So when we talk about Section 177 or Section 177 states, that's what we're referring to, is Vermont's exercise their authority under Section 177 to adopt California emission standards. Looking at the zero emission vehicle regulation, the ZEV regulation, that's part of California's Advanced Clean Cars program. And that impacts light duty vehicles through model year 2025. The Advanced Clean Car program includes multiple components, including the low emission vehicle or the LEV regulation. And that includes fleet average emission standards for criteria pollutants and for greenhouse gases. It also includes the ZEV regulation, which really is the technology forcing regulation designed to accelerate the commercialization of battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And Vermont has adopted both the LEV and ZEV regulations. Under the ZEV regulation, major auto manufacturers are required to meet an increasing share of their new ZEV sales, of their new vehicle sales with ZEVs through model year 2025. And this ZEV regulation really has been a major contributor to the commercialization of ZEV technologies and specifically delivery of EVs available for sale in Vermont today. Looking more recently, California has announced new amendments to their Advanced Clean Cars program. It's Advanced Clean Cars 2. And these will affect model year 2026 and beyond. And California is currently in the process of establishing the next set of these LEV and ZEV requirements. Again, maximizing criteria and greenhouse gas emission reductions and accelerating the transition to ZEVs. California has been holding workshops. They're continuing to hold workshops, and as they're developing the regulations, they're also working with the Section 177 states. And they do expect to have a final package to go to their board for approval in June 2022. So that's kind of the next steps for the ZEV regulation. And right now their proposal, their starting stringency that they proposed for the ZEV requirement starting in model year 2026 is 26% new vehicle sales need to be zero emission vehicles and plug-in hybrids. And that ramps up through 2035 where it's 100% requirement. And changing gears a little bit, Vermont has signed on, excuse me, to a multi-state medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle memorandum of understanding, along with 14 other states and the District of Columbia. And that ZEV MOU is really to support rapid expansion of zero emission vehicles in the truck market. The MOU sets ZEV sales targets, 30% ZEV sales by 2030 and 100% ZEV sales by 2050. And as part of this MOU, the states that have signed on are tasked with developing a ZEV action plan for the medium and heavy duty sector. And this multi-state plan is being facilitated by NESCOM. They are coordinating the efforts to do that. And the plan's going to identify market enabling strategies we can use to meet the goals of the MOU, looking at incentives, outreach and education, innovative financing mechanisms, infrastructure, utility investment programs, rate design, and again, regulation adoption. And speaking of regulation adoption, looking to California again, they've adopted their advanced clean truck regulation to accelerate a large-scale transition of zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles from class 2B to class 8. And I will attempt to share my screen because I think providing a visual of what it is I'm talking about is helpful. Can you see my screen? Has pictures of trucks?
Yes.
Excellent. So these are the groups of medium and heavy duty vehicles. When we say class 2B to class 8, it's a wide variety. And this is a manufacturer's ZEV sales requirement where manufacturers must sell ZEVs as a percentage of annual sales beginning in model year 2024 through 2035. And each year, the percent ZEVs required increases. And this is just a look at those different categories of vehicles and the percent increase each year. And of course, in Vermont, we are looking at the California Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. We are evaluating emissions and health benefits and cost impacts. We are waiting on some additional modeling results, but we hope to have those in soon. And how do I stop sharing? Oh, there it is. Okay, that's really all I had.
Got a question, Richard?
Well, two questions. First, do fleet standards convert or proportionately to projected sales in Vermont? If the manufacturer has a fleet standard, how do we get our fair share of that? That's the first question. Second question is, what fraction of the emission reduction requirements that we have to find under the Global Warming Solutions Act could we expect to get just because of these adopting these standards and staying enrolled in the California program?
And by when? To the last question, if possible.
So those are remarkably important questions. I don't think Deidre, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we know yet, in part because we don't have the clear final plan yet from CARB on where the light duty vehicle piece will go, for sure. But I think that's something that we'll want to discuss more with Cadmus and EFG and figure out how to model that to the point where we can try to understand it as a pathway.
Well, at least for the purposes of the committee, is it half or is it a quarter or is it 70%? I mean, what else do we have to do on top of this? Do you have any idea? You must.
I really can't say at this time.
Okay. So
is it possible to say ever? Because you just hit on the question this is why we presented this. your question, Rich, is very, very timely in my opinion. Is that possible to do?
Yeah, we'll have to make certain assumptions, but that's the point. We're not saying it can't be done. It just hasn't been done to this point.
Okay, cool. That's good news. Thanks.
And I would say other states that have also signed on to these programs are asking similar questions. And I think it does help. It helps get you there. Federal action is very important. But I think that there are additional strategies to accelerate that stock turnover and other things like that are important. So to Peter's point, I think that is exactly what we'll be helping to do in the LEAP modeling, is sort of showing how much that slice gets and what else needs to go on top.
Thank you. Back to you, Peter.
Great. Dave and then Joey.
Thank you, Peter. Is it correct that California earlier on in the ZEV program picked up the slack for other states, but now that has ended and that states are going to have to do the things that Rich in his questions implied?
Regarding the ZEV regulation, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was a state's not doing the work. It was the regulation provisions that provided a lot of flexibility to the vehicle manufacturers to decrease their burden. The regulation provides various pathways in which the manufacturers can comply with the regulation. And in the beginning, very early stages, the manufacturers could comply with the regulation just by delivering electric vehicles for sale in California. And then that credit traveled to the eastern states and sufficed as meeting the regulation. So it was more of flexibility provisions for the manufacturers, but much of those have disappeared. Now, I think as of 2017, that particular one has sunset, so that vehicle manufacturers are required to meet the regulation in each state. But there are some provisions in there that still allow for some kind of flexibility for the manufacturers, because there's an eastern pool where they can transfer, credits. They can oversell vehicles, let's say in New York, and then transfer some of those credits to their credit bank in Vermont to meet. We've been watching that and tracking that, and Vermont actually has benefited from that, which was kind of surprising. We expected for the vehicle manufacturers to do exactly what I said, is to deliver for sale vehicles in larger metropolitan areas and then just use credits to meet Vermont requirements. But actually, we're seeing more deliveries in Vermont, and then some of our credits, manufacturers' credits being used elsewhere to meet other states that they didn't quite meet the requirement with straight vehicle sales.
Great. Let's stop there, Deirdre. I do want to check in, Jane. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we got cut off, but Zoom gave us the boot. Is that going to happen again?
No.
Okay.
We don't have a steering committee meeting today to figure out this.
Great. So
And Marianne fix that problem too. So.
All right. Because I just want to give us the opportunity for those who can stick around for this conversation to continue this conversation, because it's really important. Joey, go ahead.
Well, let me just say something. I'll turn it over to Gina, which is, I don't think we're going to have the time to have the full conversation that we're going to need on TCI or beyond at this moment. But I just want to underscore that our view is just we need to continue some of the regulatory tools that we have in our toolbox, and we need to do more. And I look forward to, opportunity to have a bigger conversation. One of the questions I have for Deirdre is, what are the needed moments of intervention for Vermont to continue in this program or to expand our participation? Because it seems to me that some action or some recommendation of the council recognizing that this program is working and is serving people well and is like a tool in the toolbox that, that we're gonna need. I know that my understanding is based on some personal evidence of, is that, people in Vermont are able to buy plug-in hybrids that may not be available in other states because we are participating in this program. So it's really important. Are there specific moments of intervention or needs that we can push to ensure participation? And what are they?
Yeah. Regarding the light duty side of things with California's advanced clean cars, like I said, we've adopted that. However, when they issue their amendments in 2022, Vermont would need to make the decision to continue and amend our regulations. So we would have to have a rulemaking for us to continue with that program at that time. And then regarding the heavy duty side, medium and heavy duty side, like I said, we were looking at the California Advanced Clean Trucks. In order to not miss out on a model year and join at the beginning of this kind of regulation, beginning with the first model year's applicability, we would need to have a rulemaking and adopt by the end of this year. And like I said, we were still evaluating. We were waiting on some modeling results. Things have been moving relatively slowly, but that's kind of another piece right there. If we don't make it at the end of this, if Vermont decides to sign on or to adopt, if we don't make the rulemaking before the end of this year, we do miss a model year, but we can always join for the next model year.
Thank you. And I interrupted my fabulous friend and colleague, Gina, who I know has to peel momentarily. So what else do you want to add, Gina?
Well, Deirdre, there's a lot of planning embedded. It's my I have knowledge this deep on these programs. There's the regulatory side, but then there's a lot of planning around information education. And you listed the things off in the heavy duty sector, and to me, it's syncing up what's in this in the Climate Council's work, in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and in the ZEV plan, and making sure things are synced together in terms of our recommendations, be them incentives or outreach and education or R&D around heavy duty. So does the timing work for us to coordinate? Because those documents that you described are really important, and they will reinforce what we're trying to do. And I guess this is a question for Peter too. How does DC plan to work together with us and with public service on getting that all coordinated in terms of the planning side? The regulatory side speaks for itself.
I guess I'm not entirely clear what we would need from the planning side.
Well, Deirdre, you talked about different strategies, particularly around heavy duty, that aren't regulatory, but they could involve research and development. There's some cost benefit analysis. There's other sort of a plan, a ZEV, a heavy duty ZEV plan. Can we coordinate that plan with this plan and with the Public Service Department's plan? So we don't have multiple plans out there and they reinforce each other. This is somewhat of a geeky planning.
It's a very, we had a lot of, the governments love to plan and they never line up.
That's right.
So yeah, let us get an update for where those stand and we'll bring it back to you next time. How about that?
Okay, thank you.
So
where do we go from here? I have literally 5 minutes. I have another commitment. It's 2 o'clock standing thing at the food bank that I have to walk out of here.
Yep, understood.
And in TCI, we need to have that conversation along with a lot of other things. So I'm just.
I'd love to take some more time at the next meeting and devote, I think transportation is one of our meatier subject areas, and go a little bit deeper on some of these topics, specifically TCI and the fee bait and other things you mentioned, if you would like, for the next meeting.
I agree with that. Why don't we plan to lead with transportation and spend a fair amount of time on it? And if either the consultants or the department can provide us with some more information about the scale of the challenge that we're facing, it would help. That is, how much do we think we can gain from these efficiency standards, and how much are we going to need to do to accelerate savings in other ways, particularly by 2025. I mean, a lot of this savings I've been hearing about just recently, look like they're going to be in later model years, and we have a really hardcore mandate for 2025.
Yep. I would reflect, and maybe Jane, you can weigh in here, that I think our conversation around the first mitigation pathway that SEI has run will probably be a good focusing discussion around what that looks like, and what we think, and what questions, and how we want to query that. I think that will draw a lot of this conversation, and that will probably be how we lead the next meeting, and then devote significant time. I certainly think from my perspective, the non-energy piece could take a back seat, and I'd be happy to move forward with devoting all of what time we might parse out from Mars to transportation.
And I think it's incumbent on Joey and me to come up with some key questions for the group to reflect on, not just a list of items, but key questions that would help us.
I agree. And I would also just say, I was going to echo or say the same thing you just did, Peter, about, I would also just say that I think this conversation will be informed by the conversation that's going to happen at the steering committee level, until it related to the level of specificity we're going to get to in our plan. Some of the things that we are talking about and we'd like to explore further are less actionable and ready and ripe than others. We asked Deirdre to present today because there's been so much great work, and there's value in the program and continuing it. And TCI is also fairly well baked, and we'd welcome a conversation about that and what else, and save further conversations for a little further down the road.
Okay, yeah, and just to chime back in, Peter, on that, my take would be that we need to devote more time also to buildings. So trying to carve out time for transportation and buildings in our next meeting or two seems to me to be high priority for us.
We agree with that. Liz is spokesperson for the electricity sector. You're comfortable with that? Good. All right. Jared.
Thanks. Speaking of schedule, I just have a clarifying question. My understanding is that if we're on a regular schedule, our next cross-sector meeting is Thursday, August 19th from 11 to 2. That is also the day, which I had assumed was intentional, that we've got the workshop with the Public Service Department on the kind of thermal sector, comprehensive energy plan, climate action plan. I think that's 9 to 1, and our meeting is 11 to 2. I'd assumed we wanted those to overlap because it was co-hosted by the cross-sector mitigation committee. But if that's the case, we'll only have an extra hour at the end of that to continue the transportation conversation or something else. So, but that would be a very long day, 9 to 2. Just wanted to flag that. I noticed that on my schedule and see if that was intentional or if we have to figure something out.
We have some work to do. All right. There are too many meetings in a given week to possibly schedule. We will be in touch about some way to schedule a bit of an ad hoc meeting then, because we do have a lot to talk about, and we can't just tack on an hour to the end of a otherwise longer meeting. That won't be enough. So,
Agreed.
Jane.
Just to clarify then, it'd be great if the subcommittee just acts now. Should we cancel that subcommittee meeting and have Marianne and I work on behalf with all of you to schedule another time that week?
Yes.
I agree with that, Jim. Thanks, Jared, for the heads up.
Good catch. Good catch now. All right, it's 2 o'clock, but we want to make sure that we have time for the public to weigh in. If there are members of the public that would like to make a comment, we would love to hear you.
George, you're up.
Hi. I wanted to follow up on the transportation discussion in the context of the medium and heavy duty vehicle market. National Academy of Science has issued several reports in this area. I've read a large part of that report. A principal finding of it was that they foresee, simply on the basis of just energy density of the power plant, that diesel engines will likely be the dominant source of propulsion for the forecast period that they study. They did foresee significant energy efficiency improvements, but the technologies that they studied led to about a 30% improvement, provided they all got taken and put into deployment. In parallel, they also looked at biofuels. There's a question mark on my part on whether they made a realistic assumption about the ability to scale biofuel blends to a larger percentage for biodiesel in particular. There have been a lot of R&D over the last decade by the Department of Energy on cellulosic bioenergy pathways for biodiesel and bioethanol in the context of the renewable fuel standard. Those efforts at pilot plants apparently did not succeed. And it's ambiguous at this point to me what their next step would be. So other than applications that are short haul freight, less than 500 miles a day, it seems unlikely you would have the class 7 through class 8 long haul freight trucks migrating to electric vehicles, electric propulsion. They did study that as well, but it's ambiguous how much you could get packed into it simply because the density of lithium batteries is not the same as your energy density of diesel fuel. So I would encourage review of that report and soak on it to try and see if in fact the migration to electric propulsion for the vehicle fleet in Vermont is as straightforward as just moving to electric vehicles, or whether there's going to have to be a more nuanced look at that part of the market. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Any other comments? Any final comments from members of the committee? I'll simply close by saying thanks to everybody, and it's encouraging to be bearing down on some of the thorny questions that we need to address. I'm looking forward to more of the same in upcoming meetings.
Absolutely. I'll echo that. We have lots to work through, and today was a really good step forward in terms of getting into the detail and trying to wrestle with those challenging topics. So thank you all. We'll be in touch about scheduling the next meeting.
All right, we stand adjourned. Thank you.